Well, rejoice, because unless anything particularly uncommon happens over the next few months, this is the last time you'll be seeing Tropical Tracker on your screen, at least until May of next year. We'll go ahead and recap the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season, which officially ended 1 week ago and started, in air quotes here, on June 1st with Tropical Storm Arlene over the Gulf of Mexico. A classic early season storm with this pretty sheared convection separated from that main swirl of low pressure down at the low levels here. But this wasn't the first storm of the year. Recall that we had a subtropical storm that did not get a name and was kind of designated after the fact by the National Hurricane Center way back in January. An example of these off-season storms that could actually, be something to keep our eyes on from time to time as we go through the next few months in the Atlantic here. And Arlene was a bit of a rainmaker for portions of Florida. See some of that lightning activity off the west coast of the state, for example, and that's something to always kind of keep in mind when we're talking about tropical cyclones. Is it's not just about that wind at the center. But let's go ahead and look at our track map throughout the year here. We ended up with 20 total named storms, almost exhausted the name list here, and we had a couple of attempts to try to finish it out with Tropical Depression 21 over Nicaragua and a potential tropical cyclone 22 that couldn't quite get its act together late in the season here. But a few notable tracks to point out here. Category 5 Hurricane Lee that began in the main development region in the Atlantic and moved up and became a very powerful extratropical cyclone as it moved towards Maine and Atlantic Canada. I recall this as a potential impact on one of my Florida State football games back in September. And then other storms like Idalia here, which I'll zoom in on later in this edition of Tropical Tracker. Another powerful major hurricane landfall in the Gulf Coast, something we've seen way too much of close to home over the past few years. Let's go ahead and revisit the seasonal forecast here, because the kind of most common forecast that we saw from many agencies was a near normal season. It was a bit of a tricky seasonal forecast based on two notable competing factors. First, El Nino in the Pacific Ocean. That's been established for several months now, which typically climatologically leads to above normal wind shear in the Atlantic, and that tends to harm organization of these disturbances that want to form into tropical cyclones, and is generally a negative influence, keeping those numbers down. So a good thing for us. Should maybe not say negative in that case. But competing against a record warm tropical Atlantic, which we saw especially in the early portions of the season, and that led to early season storms like Brett and Cindy that formed all the way out in the main development region in the eastern Atlantic Ocean before we had really that kind of more favorable forcing that we tend to see towards the peak of the hurricane season there. But in terms of which of these factors won, it sort of depends on the metric you look at. If we're talking about something like named storms, we ended up well above average with 20 again, as well as accumulated cyclone energy running a bit above average. But if we're looking at metrics like hurricanes and major hurricanes, right about that 1991 to 2020 average. So I'd say those seasonal forecasts verified fairly well, especially as we got closer to the season and that signal from the warm Atlantic really became much more of a prominent factor. Looking at this accumulated cyclone energy metric one more time, this is again our combined metric that accounts for both the intensity and duration of tropical cyclones. We're running a bit on the higher end here in our 73-year historical climatology, running as about the 16th most active season in that record here, which is the higher ACE number than we had in 2021 and 2022, for example, but not quite as high as what we saw in the 2020 season, where we, of course, set our record of 30 named storms in the Atlantic. Part of that owing to better technology that we've had relative to, say, the 80s and 90s to be able to kind of detect these weaker and short-lived tropical cyclones. And another reason why those named storm numbers have really been high these last few years. But let's just go ahead and animate the peak of the season here, starting in the middle of August, because after a lull in activity from, say, mid-July through around August 10th, we had a very active period here where we saw 13 different named storms over the span of about 6 weeks or so, including, again, Category 5 Lee, which was a very long-lived, long-tracked hurricane that brushed near Bermuda and then completed a powerful extratropical transition as it moved up towards Maine and Atlantic Canada. Some close-to-home activity, including storms like Ophelia, and some tricky forecasts. A lot of storms that kind of got near each other and interacted with one another in terms of their steering flow, and were kind of a hassle for the National Hurricane Center to handle. Storms like Philippe really being one of the big examples in early October. But again, Idalia was probably the main event of the season in terms of United States impacts here, starting off as a disturbance near the Yucatan Peninsula over Mexico and the Western Caribbean Sea, and eventually lifting northward and tapping into a very favorable thermodynamic environment and strengthening eventually into a Category 4 hurricane before striking the Big Bend of Florida here. It was the 8th major hurricane to make landfall along the United States Gulf Coast, dating back to 2017. This follows an 11-year period where we did not have any major hurricane landfalls in the United States, and has really been one of the more noteworthy times on record here for United States hurricane impacts. But we'll go ahead and wrap up with a look ahead to the offseason, because the work does not necessarily end, even though hurricane season has officially ended. The National Hurricane Center has already put in the work to some of their postseason analysis of these storms and making adjustments to the best track intensities and positions and taking in as much data as they can. They've produced these tropical cyclone reports for 8 storms already, going back from our subtropical January storm all the way through Rena, actually, pretty recently. Also worth keeping an eye out for the potential for some off-season storms like we saw in January. Most months have seen at least one storm in the historical record. So these are uncommon but not necessarily unprecedented. But kind of the main event to look forward to in March or April here is the meeting of the World Meteorological Organization's Hurricane Committee, which takes place to evaluate forecasts, recommend changes to warning products that you may see for next year, but also to retire and replace names. So around March or April is when we're going to see if storms like Idalia or Lee will be retired. Your forecast summary is coming up next.